Hello, Brian Weeks here again with another MMCD contract consideration. This video clip will cover the topic of cost types and reimbursability. In this slightly longer video, I'm going to discuss contract costs from a contractor's perspective and the owner's liability for reimbursement from the contract administrator's perspective. In particular, I hope to clarify for you the difference between indirect and impact costs, terms which are often misused or incorrectly used interchangeably. I will also review the three types of overhead costs, how they relate to each other, and when an owner can become liable to pay for them. Overhead costs are a fairly complicated topic, which generates questions in numerous areas. This video is intended to give an overall perspective on the topic, but I have several other contract considerations which deal with overheads in specific areas. If you need additional discussion, please see Dealing with Delays, Fair Standby Charges, Implications of Optional Work, and What does GC 13.10 really mean? First, let's look at project cost structure as the contractor views it at the time of tender preparation. At the highest level, the contractor determines the project expenditures to build the work. That is, the labor, equipment, materials, and subcontractor expenses, as well as all costs of site or project overhead. To this subtotal of hard costs, the estimator will add a markup to cover head office overhead and corporate profit. Typically, these markups are spread uniformly over all work items in the schedule of quantities and prices, but sometimes the estimator will unbalance the allocation for earlier recovery of those margins. At the time of tendering, the estimator will not make allowances for either indirect costs nor impact costs. If either or both of these types of costs occur, those that can be quantified will later be added to the final project cost by the corporate accountants. Now, I've just used the terms indirect costs and impact costs without defining them. Let me do that now so as to clear up any misunderstanding. Please note, these are not MMCD defined terms, so we must defer to common industry understandings. Indirect costs are typically those which are second level or once removed from project events. They are simpler than impact costs, which I'll define next, because the MMCD specifically excludes any liability on the part of the owner for indirect costs which the contractor incurs other than those within accepted or negotiated quotations. Here are some examples to explain them. Say a project is legitimately extended through changes. Under the MMCD, a contractor has no option but to perform changes properly authorized via change orders. This may well extend a project beyond the originally committed substantial performance date. This extension might cause the contractor to be unable to bid a subsequent project or delay the availability of crew and equipment for the next project. Both of these situations are indirect costs, but the owner on the current project is protected against liability for such costs, except those buried in quotations which the contractor provided and which were accepted by the CA as allowed by GC 9.2.3.1. From my own experience, one of the biggest indirect costs we incurred was the lost opportunities our company missed because our president had to spend so much time looking backwards to deal with a large claim. Although subsequently successful at arbitration, this prevented him from looking forward and taking advantage of new opportunities during the dispute resolution. A final example is the all too real effects of diminished corporate reputation when a project goes bad, no matter whose fault it is. In my experience, there's always enough blame to share amongst all the participants. These last two examples highlight a key element of indirect costs. They're almost impossible to quantify with any accuracy. Indirect costs are also never budgeted into the tender pricing, as no one really anticipates them or wants to put unsupported numbers into a competitive tender. Now let me define impact costs. They are those which result from unexpected occurrences during the project, Unexpected means unforeseeable at the time of tendering based on the information available then and the knowledge known to competent bidders about the site. Such occurrences might include the unexpected discovery of unforeseen utilities, problem ground conditions, hazardous materials, or archaeological finds. Other examples include abnormal weather and the authorized extension of a project via change orders into bad weather conditions. By their very nature, unexpected occurrences were not budgeted into the tender. Normally, this means that the owner will become liable to reimburse the contractor. This reimbursement will be for both the direct costs of dealing with the problems, plus the impact the event or occurrence had on the contractor's schedule, workforce, and efficiency. As we'll see in the next slide, these impacts can be for both direct costs as well as site overheads. Some examples of impacts are shown. Directed relocation to do work out of sequence will have significant impact costs and perhaps even on crew efficiency. If the occurrence caused a delay, then there may be impact costs for standby during the delay and acceleration costs to get back on schedule. It is quite common for scope changes or unexpected problems on a project to extend the authorized completion date into winter months. This has compounding ramifications, all of which are reimbursable if the contractor properly documents them. Now, let's consider when an owner becomes liable for indirect and impact costs. Indirect costs are generally excluded from owner's liability. There are only two mentions of indirect costs in the general conditions. GC 13.1.12 specifically excludes indirect costs from delay claims. The exception I mentioned earlier is that when a quotation is given under GC 9.2.32, it is deemed to have included any indirect costs. From this language, one can infer that the document drafters anticipated there could be circumstances where a contractor might anticipate indirect costs and try for recovery. Impact costs are another matter. First, let's look at when an owner has no or limited liability. These are situations which result from abnormal weather or from conditions caused by third parties. Here, the owner is obliged to allow time, but is not responsible for costs. It is also logical that when the impacts are due to circumstances under the control of the contractor or its subcontractors or agents, the owner will bear no liability for impact costs. For situations where the owner is deemed liable for the occurrence that caused the impacts, the CA must fairly evaluate a contractor's claim, both for the direct work to deal with the event, plus the impact on the contractor's other costs and efficiencies. As we saw on the logic chart, and we'll see in the next example, impact costs can include direct costs plus site overheads and markup. Here's a real-life example scenario where the owner was liable for impact costs. I cannot stress strongly enough that it is the contractor's responsibility to properly document and present all costs for reimbursement. That is not the CA's job. The CA's job is to fairly evaluate both the entitlement and the quantum of any costs claimed. In this example, the contractor was laying sewer pipe in an area which had previously been approved for work after being twice evaluated by archaeological specialists. Nevertheless, the contractor exposed a skeleton, later determined to be over 700 years old. As Murphy would have it, this was right on the sewer centerline. Upon notification, the CA immediately halted work and issued a change order to fence off and protect the area of the find. After a couple of days, when it became clear that the investigation would take some time, the CA directed the contractor to work on another branch of the sewer, which had originally been scheduled for work later in the project. As a result of this, the contractor incurred downtime waiting for instructions, then had to mobilize his crews and equipment to the second point, and later back to the original halt point. In addition, materials for the second segment had not yet been ordered and had to be rush freighted to the site. A scheduled paving subcontractor was not available at the new time, so premium costs were incurred to use a different paver. Working out of sequence was inefficient, as not all the finalized drawing changes were available, so some work had to be redone. In order to get back on schedule when the original location was finally released for construction, the contractor incurred acceleration costs for additional overtime. Given these circumstances, you can see that the owner became liable not only for the direct costs of the problem, that is, securing and protecting the find, but also the much more significant impact costs I just outlined. Despite the relocation, the project schedule was extended for several days, so the owner also became liable for all project overheads for those days. Finally, all the costs, both direct and overhead, were entitled to be marked up 10% for general overhead and profit. This brings us to the complicated issue of overheads. While GC1 does define general overheads, it does not define site overheads, which is sometimes called project overhead, nor work item overhead. Yes, there are three classes of overhead. I'll do my best to clarify them for you. First, general overhead is defined as costs which are not directly expended for the contract. The GC does exclude equipment fixed costs from general overhead, so contractors can include those in their equipment rates. General overhead is informally considered any head office, shop, or other costs not incurred on the project site. Although the GCs do not define the word overhead, the context of the usage in Instructions to Tenderers 10.1.3, General Condition 10.1.1, and General Condition 13.1.1 imply reference to site or project overheads. Since definitions are lacking in the MMCD, we must revert to definitions understood in common construction usage. I suggest the following practical tests to determine if a cost is project or site overhead, or if it is a work item overhead. Project or site overhead are things which are A, necessary for the project itself, not head office executives, support staff, administrators, or other such, and B, needed for most, if not all work tasks on the project, and C, whose presence can be verified on site by a CA or an inspector. On the other hand, work item overhead are things which are A, necessary for one or a few items on the schedule of quantities and prices, and B, whose presence can be verified on site by a CA or an inspector. In short, if a claimed item is not observable and quantifiable by the CA or inspector, it would normally be classed as general overhead. This slide shows the logical relationship of the three types of overhead costs. From it, you can see the on-site rule is used to differentiate general overheads. Here are some examples of general overhead. Head office executives and support staff. Head office land, buildings, and shop, yard and/or warehouse, and their personnel. Generalized employee training, corporate insurance and financing. Then we have the rule to differentiate between site overheads and work item overheads. How specific is the cost to a work item? Here are some examples of site or project overheads. Project bonds and insurance, superintendent and field clerk wages, site vehicles, including staff trucks and support vehicles such as fuel trucks, lunchroom, tool cribs, first aid trailers, traffic control personnel, traffic control signs and equipment. You can see all these examples relate to things on this specific project, but are not required for just one or a few work items. This is just a small sample of items which could be classified as site overheads, but it should give you the idea. Work item overheads will, naturally, be specific to the type of work item being done. They are classified as overhead costs because they are not related to the quantity of the work item being done. Some examples will help to clarify this. Trench shoring cages for underground work, curb profile forms for concrete forming, test plugs for pipe testing, dewatering equipment, special access training, such as for railroad right-of-ways, special handling training, such as for hazardous materials. Once again, I'm sure you've encountered many more examples of this type of overhead cost. Of course, there will always be areas of uncertainty. For example, is a superintendent who is shared among several jobs classified as project overhead or general overhead? Similarly, how many work items does an overhead item need to be used for to switch it from being work item overhead to project overhead? As always, the CA who is evaluating a claim must fairly take into account the specific circumstances of the project and its management. Having defined the three types of overhead costs, let us now consider when an owner is obliged to reimburse a contractor for claimed overhead. At the time of tendering, or when providing the quotation required for a change order, the submitted prices are required to be complete and are deemed to have included all types of overhead and all other costs and markups in accordance with either IT 10.1 for the tender or GC 9.2.3 for the quotation. The owner will not be liable for any additional costs unless the contractor can prove some difference in conditions from that understood when the pricing was provided. According to GC 9.2.1, pricing by force account is intended to be a fallback for circumstances when agreement cannot be reached before a change order item must commence. By obtaining an acceptable quotation first, the owner would be protected against subsequent claims for overheads and time, as those are deemed to be included in the quotation. However, when work must be costed using the force account method, overheads can be included. Work item specific overheads can be claimed on an item-by-item basis, providing they were needed for the work being done by force account. Site overheads can usually be claimed on a day-by-day basis if the project is being delayed by the directed work. Finally, the contractor is entitled to a 10% markup on all itemized costs to cover general overhead and profit. When an owner is deemed liable for a delay, the same conditions apply to overhead reimbursement. But when whether or a third party is responsible for a delay, the owner is not liable for costs. However, the CA must award an equivalent extension to the substantial performance date so the contractor does not risk incurring liquidated damages for those delayed days. To summarize, 1. Impact and indirect costs are not the same thing. Although not defined in the MMCD, they have different meanings and cost recovery implications. 2. Indirect costs are not generally recoverable under the MMCD. 3. Impact and indirect costs are deemed to have been included in any quotation a contractor provides. 4. When an owner is liable for impact costs, the costs may include both direct and overhead costs, both with an allowed markup. 5. General overhead costs are defined in the MMCD. They are distinguishable by not being able to be verified or quantified on site. 6. General overhead costs and profit are recovered by the 10% markup allowed on force account work, or are buried within a quoted price. 7. Site or project overheads relate to the work project as a whole and can be verified on site. They should be listed on force account forms as soon as they can be quantified. Work item overheads are also verifiable on site and should be listed separately on the force account forms daily. 9. If the owner is deemed liable for delays, then it will also be responsible to cover all site overhead costs for those delay days. 10. If the owner is liable for costs to build a work item, those costs will include the required work item overheads. I hope that this has helped clarify this contract consideration. Please check our website for further assistance and to see what other topics are presented in this series. Thanks for watching.